What if I told you that one of the most stable borders on Earth, nearly 0 kilometers of quiet forest, shared lakes, and interwoven economies can fracture not with armies, but with a sentence? Because that's what happened when Donald Trump revived a challenge that strikes at the core of Canada's economic identity. And the response that came back from former Bank of Canada and Bank of England Governor Mark Carney wasn't diplomatic smoothing over or cautious politeness. It was a rebuff so pointed, so structurally, revealing that it exposed a deeper truth about the balance of power between the world's largest economy and the nation most tied to it. On the surface, it looked like another headline in a long-running political drama. But underneath there was something else. The quiet mechanics of dependency, leverage, and economic statecraft that have defined North America for half a century. Trump's challenge wasn't just about tariffs or trade deficits or a personal rivalry. You and I have heard those arguments before. This time, the pressure came wrapped in a bigger claim that Canada had grown too comfortable under the American security umbrella and too prosperous under American market access, and that this imbalance had to be corrected. It was a familiar message, delivered in a sharper key. Yet what made the moment extraordinary wasn't the message itself, but the reply. Carney, a man normally associated with technocratic caution and finally balanced phrasing, answered with something far more blunt, that Canada would not be intimidated, that its economy was more resilient than Washington assumed, and that the structural vulnerabilities Trump invoked were wildly misunderstood. What sounded like political theater was in fact an argument about economic gravity.
To understand why this was such a dangerous moment, we have to start with the simple but unsettling paradox. Canada is both one of the world's richest nations and one of its most dependent.
34 of its exports go to a single customer.
Its currency rises and falls more with U.S. industrial cycles than with its own domestic productivity. Its financial markets price risk through a lens shaped in New York rather than Toronto.
On one hand, this integration has delivered decades of prosperity. On the other, it gives any Washington immense leverage if it chooses to use it. That leverage remains invisible until a political shock brings it into view. Trump merely pointed a flashlight at something that has been there all along. Carney's rebuff mattered because it flipped the script.
Instead of accepting the premise that Canada was lucky to have U.S. access, he argued that the United States is equally reliant on the stability, resources, and manufacturing flows that cross the border every hour.
It was a reminder that continental prosperity is a two-way system, not a patron-client relationship. 25% of U.S. energy imports come from Canada. Millions of American jobs depend on integrated supply chains that treat the border not as a line, but as a seam. And when U.S. industries, from autos to aerospace, calculate their global competitiveness, they implicitly assume that Canadian inputs will remain predictable and cost-effective. What looked like a challenge from Washington was in reality a two-gulf war between two economies that function less like neighbors and more like components in the same machine. But this raises a more unsettling question. Why did such an integrated system become so vulnerable to political shocks? To answer that, we need to go back to the historical moment when North America rewired itself economically. Because the origins of this conflict lie not in today's headlines, but in decisions made decades ago. Decisions that tied the fate of the continent together long before Trump or Carney ever entered the scene. It began in the late 20th century when both countries were grappling with forces larger than themselves, the collapse of old manufacturing models, the rise of global competition, and the accelerating shift toward liberalized trade. Canada, long wary of being economically absorbed by its southern neighbor, had spent much of the post-war era balancing integration with protection. Yet by the mid-1980 seconds, a new reality had emerged. Canadian industries were struggling to scale. American firms were searching for continental efficiency, and geopolitical pressure from Japan and Europe was mounting. The result was a turning point. Disguised as a treaty, the 1988 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, followed a few years later by NAFTA. These weren't just trade deals. They were the architecture of a new system, one that fused supply chains, harmonized standards, and locked both countries into a shared economic destiny. From that moment on, the border became less relevant to manufacturers than the clock speed of their logistics. Auto parts assembled in Ontario crossed into Michigan, returned to Ontario, and crossed back again before becoming a finished vehicle.
Wheat grown in Saskatchewan traveled through American rail lines before reaching global ports. Energy flowed south, consumer goods flowed north, and financial capital treated both countries as a combined ecosystem.
It was efficient, profitable, and politically stable for a time. But hidden within this new architecture was a structural tension integration without insulation. Neither country had built safeguards for what might happen if one side suddenly weaponized the relationship. Both simply assumed the other would never do so. That assumption held until the world changed in the early 2000s. Globalization accelerated. China's rise reshaped manufacturing, economics, and labor dislocations across the American Midwest, generated political blowback. Even then, the U.S.-Canada relationship seemed insulated from the turbulence. Both economies moved in parallel. Both governments favored predictability. Both societies trusted the continental framework, but the seeds of vulnerability were already planted. The more integrated the system became, the higher the stakes if it ever fractured. And when Trump entered office with a mandate centered on economic nationalism, the unthinkable became negotiable. The challenge he issued first in renegotiating NAFTA into USMCA, then in broader claims about Canadian unfairness, was not simply rhetorical. It was a test of the entire continental model. It exposed the fact that Canada, despite its wealth, did not possess many levers to retaliate without harming itself. It also revealed something equally surprising, that the United States, despite its power, could not easily sever the relationship without undermining its own industrial base. The system had become a binding constraint on both sides, and that is why Carney's rebuke landed with such force. It wasn't just a counterargument. It was a reminder of the structural symmetry that political narratives often ignore. Yet as dramatic as this moment seems, it remains only one layer of the story. Beneath it lies a deeper question. What exactly is the nature of a modern economic alliance between unequal partners? Is it a marriage of convenience, a geopolitical strategy, or a shared wager on continental prosperity? To answer that, we need to define the system more. Precisely what it includes, what it excludes, and why most people misunderstand its true dynamics. When we talk about the U.S.-Canada economic system, we often reach for simple analogies. Two friendly neighbors trading goods across a long border, or a large market supporting a smaller one. But these metaphors fail to capture the true scale and density of what has evolved. At its core, the relationship is not bilateral in the traditional sense. It is a continental production network, something closer to a shared operating system than a trade partnership. Understanding this distinction is crucial because most political arguments, including Trump's challenge and Carney's response, rest on outdated assumptions about what each country can unilaterally change. In plain terms, the system includes the flow of goods, services, energy, capital, labor, and data that move between the two economies every hour. It includes the regulatory alignments that allow a medical device certified in one country to be sold in the other without costly duplication. It includes the integrated financial markets that treat prosper lending, portfolio flows, and corporate financing as part of one liquidity pool. And it includes the physical infrastructure, pipelines, bridges, railways, and power grids that ignores political boundaries, even when politicians do not. What it does not include, however, is an equivalent alignment in domestic policy aims. Canada and the United States often diverge on industrial strategy, climate policy, social welfare, tax regimes, and foreign priorities. The system delivers shared prosperity, but not shared governance. This is where misunderstandings creep in. Ordinary citizens often imagine that if political tensions escalate, each country can simply pull back from the relationship. But the integration is asymmetric and path-dependent. Canada cannot diversify away from the U.S. market overnight because its industries were built around U.S. scale demand and U.S. logistics. The United States cannot abruptly replace Canadian energy or rare minerals because its industries depend on them for price stability and supply security. In other words, each country holds leverage that looks modest on paper but becomes immense when embedded in the physical and financial architecture of both economies. And this architecture shapes behavior. It explains why moments of political confrontation can feel more dramatic than they actually are. When Washington threatens tariffs, the fear in Canada is not just economic pain. It is the possibility that a system designed for cooperation could suddenly be used as a tool for coercion. When Ottawa asserts its resilience, the subtext is not defiance but reassurance, a reminder that interdependence runs both ways and cannot be severed without mutual damage. This duality, strength through integration, vulnerability through the same mechanism, is a structural truth hidden beneath every headline. From this vantage point, Carney's rebuttal has a different meaning. He was not simply responding to a political provocation. He was correcting a conceptual error about how the continental system actually functions. He was saying, in essence, that North America is not a hierarchy but a network, and that networks do not respond well to unilateral pressure. This is the big secret of the USC-Canada relationship. The very interdependence that seems to give one side leverage also constrains it. The moment you try to weaponize the system pushes back. But secrets like this do not remain secret for long, especially when political incentives reward confrontation. And that leads us into the risks, the failure modes, doom loops, and feedback mechanisms that can transform a stable continental machine into one vulnerable to shocks, whether triggered by elections, economic downturns, or geopolitical realignments far beyond North America's borders. The first and most obvious risk is political escalation. When leaders treat integrated supply chains as bargaining chips rather than shared assets, in a system this dense, even a modest threat can trigger outsized consequences. A tariff proposal floated in Washington to appeal to domestic voters may cause Canadian producers to delay investments, hedge currency exposure, or shift shipments through alternative routes. Those defensive moves feed uncertainty back into U.S. industries that rely on stable inputs, prompting firms to lobby, stockpile, or cut production. What begins as a symbolic gesture can cascade into a reinforcing loop of fear and reaction. And once firms internalize the idea that the political environment itself is unstable, they redesign their operations around that instability, embedding fragility into a system that once prized reliability. A second failure mode lies in energy interdependence. For decades, the quiet anchor of the USC-Canada relationship has been the uninterrupted flow of oil, gas, hydro oil, electricity, and critical minerals across the border. This flow stabilizes prices, buffers supply shocks, and keeps the continent insulated from geopolitical disruptions. But it also creates a paradoxical vulnerability. If political tensions escalate, any disruption, real or perceived, hits both economies simultaneously. American refiners depend on Canadian crude to maintain throughput. Canadian producers depend on U.S. pipelines and GF Coast refineries to reach global markets. If either side threatens the arrangement, even rhetorically, the market reacts instantly. Volatility spikes. Investment stalls and companies begin exploring costly alternatives that erode the efficiency the system was built on. Energy interdependence is thus both a shield and a pressure point, depending entirely on the political climate around it. A third risk emerges in the financial system. Canadian banks hold substantial USD-denominated assets, and American investors are deeply embedded in Canadian debt markets. When political friction rises, the first tremor often appears not in trade data but in currency, spreads, bond yields, and capital flows. Investors price the possibility no matter how remote a policy rupture. For Canada, this can mean sudden depreciation of the Canadian dollar, raising import costs and tightening household budgets. For the United States, it can mean instability in sectors dependent on Canadian liquidity or cross-border credit channels. Financial markets, unlike politicians, do not wait for clarity. They react instantly, amplifying signals and sometimes turning a political statement into an economic event. History offers concrete examples of how these dynamics play out. During the 2018 NFDA renegotiations, uncertainty alone wiped out billions in planned investments, froze hiring in auto manufacturing corridors, and pushed the Canadian dollar into a downward slide. Companies on both sides of the border built contingency plans for supply chain fragmentation that would have raised consumer prices across North America. Even though a new agreement eventually emerged, the temporary shock was enough to reveal how thin the margin for error had become. The system functioned barely, not because it was resilient, but because the crisis ended before the feedback loops could fully mature. Yet perhaps the most dangerous risk is the slow erosion of trust. Integrated systems rely on more than treaties and pipelines. They depend on the expectation that cooperation is the baseline, not the exception. Political actors normalize confrontation. Firms adjust by reducing prosper exposure. Governments hedge by diversifying alliances. And the public begins to view the partnership not as a shared destiny, but as a transaction to be renegotiated constantly. Over time, this shift in mindset can do more damage than any single policy. It transforms a stable equilibrium into a fragile one, where every election becomes a potential shock and every disagreement carries the weight of structural consequence. And this brings us to the broader picture. The continental system exists within a larger global system that is itself in flux. The rise of strategic competition with China, the reordering of energy markets, and the weaponization of trade elsewhere in the world all amplify the vulnerabilities in North America's architecture. To understand why Carney's rebuttal resonated so widely, we must look beyond bilateral tensions and examine how the world's shifting power dynamics pressure this integrated structure from every direction around the world. The assumptions that once underpin globalization are eroding. Great power competition has returned. Supply chains are being redrawn along geopolitical lines, and economic alliances are being judged less by efficiency and more by strategic security. In this environment, North America's integrated system looks simultaneously like a strength and a liability. On one hand, it gives the United States and Canada continental scale unmatched by most competitors. Vast natural resources, deep capital markets, advanced manufacturing capacity, and a stable democratic bloc. On the other hand, it exposes both countries to the same external shocks, magnifies domestic political tensions, and forces them to confront the uncomfortable reality that their economic futures are more intertwined than their political narratives admit. Consider energy once more, but from the global vantage point.
As Europe scrambles to secure natural gas and Asia locks in long-term commitments for critical minerals, the U.S. and Canada sit atop the world's most reliable hydrocarbon and resource base.
Yet this advantage has become a point of competition rather than coordination. The United States wants energy independence. Canada wants energy market access. Both want to lead in the clean energy transition, but their regulatory and climate frameworks often clash. In a more cooperative era, these differences might have been smoothed over by shared long-term goals. In a fragmented world, they risk becoming friction points that competitors, whether China, Russia, or Middle Eastern suppliers, can exploit.
Carney's rebuff hinted at this tension. He was reminding Washington that continental energy security does not function if one partner feels cornered. The manufacturing landscape tells a similar story.
As the United States pursues reshoring and French-shoring strategies, Canada finds itself both a beneficiary and a potential casualty. American investments in battery plants, semiconductor facilities, and advanced manufacturing hubs increasingly rely on Canadian minerals, Canadian R&D, and Canadian supply chain reliability. But these same investments can pull industrial capacity southward if Ottawa cannot match incentives or align strategically. The result is a paradoxical competition inside a partnership. The very integration that strengthens North America's collective position on the global stage also fuels tensions over who captures the most value. This is the background noise behind Trump's economic challenges and Carney's responses. They are proxies for a deeper question about how continental prosperity is distributed. On the geopolitical front, the pressures are even greater.
As Washington reorients toward Asia, it expects allies to shoulder more responsibility. Canada, long shielded by geography and alliance structures, now faces expectations it is often sidestepped.
Expanded defense budgets, stronger Arctic security commitments, and a clearer stance on strategic technologies. When Trump frames these demands as transactional, suggesting Canada owes the United States, he taps into a long-standing American frustration. Carney's rebuttal, in contrast, reframes the issue as reciprocal obligation within a shared security architecture. Both perspectives carry truth, but only one recognizes the structural reality of interdependence. Continental defense is as integrated as continental trade, and attempts to isolate burdens or benefits distort the system they depend on. These global pressures interact with domestic political dynamics in ways that neither country can fully control. Rising populism, regional inequality, and economic insecurity create fertile ground for narratives of exploitation or unfairness. In the United States, this often manifests as claims that allies take advantage of American generosity. In Canada, it appears as fears that the country is overly dependent on its southern neighbor and vulnerable to sudden shifts in policy mood. These anxieties make the continental relationship more brittle because they inject suspicion into a system built on trust. What Carney attempted in his forceful response was to push back against a narrative that risks undermining not just bilateral goodwill, but the structural logic of North American cooperation. And yet, if we zoom out even further, the most profound tension is none of these. It is that the global economy is reorganizing into blocks defined not just by geography or trade flows, but by political values and technological ecosystem. The United States and Canada sit squarely together in one such block, but the internal contradictions of their partnership leave them less prepared than they could be for the world that is emerging. The question is no longer whether conflict between the two countries is likely, but whether they can adapt their integrated system to a geopolitical order where interdependence is both an advantage and a vulnerability. As this new world takes shape, the human dimension of the continental relationship becomes impossible to ignore. Because behind every policy clash and economic model are people, workers, consumers, families whose lives are shaped by decisions made in distant capitals. And it is here in the moral calculus of integration that the full weight of this conflict comes into view. The future of this relationship will not be decided by any single election or leader. It will be shaped by whether both countries can recognize the structural truth that Carney articulated beneath his rebuff, that North America's strength comes not from dominance but from balance. A balance of markets, resources, security, commitments, and political expectations. A balance that demands cooperation even when confrontation is tempting. A balance that acknowledges that prosperity on one side of the border cannot be maintained if instability grows on the other. In the end, the real question is not whether Trump was right or Carney was right. It is whether the continent they are arguing about can adapt to a world where interdependence is no longer an unchallenged virtue but a contested strategy. The answer will determine not only the next chapter of U.S.-Canada relations, but the everyday stability of millions of lives lived quietly along a border that has always seemed permanent until suddenly it no longer there. Friends,